these what they call RPC servers. So they use like API calls. These are pretty like standard calls that are known as like RESTful or JavaScript based calls. Sorry, it's a bit technical, but like basically allows you to like talk to the blockchain and read and write data to it. We've been like very much interested in working with a variety of different infrastructure providers. Pocket is one of them, the most recent that's just joined us. And whenever there's a new infrastructure provider providing like a set of nodes, it just adds like a lot more efficiency on the network for several reasons. Because one, it kind of like spreads out the requests, and two, it adds like fault tolerance to the network because if like one like infrastructure provider happens to have issues, people can easily switch to another one. And so, these are like the sorts of benefits that come with getting infrastructure providers on board. And of course, like the more efficient they are, the better it is. So that's kind of like I guess like the Fantom Foundation's like point of view about these sorts of like relationships.
Fantastic. And now, Michael Rourke, I was going to ask on the same topic here. What are some of the issues that Pocket Network addresses that maybe some people aren't aware of that even exist, or that blockchains face is sort of like an existential attack vector? And how do you fit into that?
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to what the other Michael was saying, Pocket is a public good, and exactly to what he said, we see ourselves contributing to the stability of the entire Fantom ecosystem. We're finding that developers building dApps are actually starting to add multiple and have been adding kind of multiple RPC providers, just due to the nature of blockchains and how finicky they can be sometimes. So you'll find, okay, one RPC provider is having issues, so I'll just have a couple backups or switch over to another one as a result. And to your question, Juan, that's exactly what Pocket really solves. Is this kind of what we're finding the biggest reason why people use Pocket today is because of reliability, actually. So blockchains, for those of you who don't know, blockchain nodes are extremely finicky. They go out of sync. They fall behind. Sometimes they get overloaded with CPUs, with in terms of CPU traffic, and things happen, right? And Pocket is unique in this respect because of the nature of the network, and we have today over 45,000 nodes across 30 countries. And what's really interesting is that instead of querying one single node provider, when a developer or someone, let's say using the Pocket RPC through your MetaMask as an example, you're actually querying hundreds or thousands of nodes at once. And with our own gateways, we have, for example, sync checkers. So if I'm querying 1,000 nodes and 100 are out of sync, well, I can then check and see, or our gateway actually checks and then says, hey, these 100 are out of sync. Let me point you over to the other 900 that are in sync, as an example. So when it comes to reliability, that's really Pocket's really big, I think, addition to the space. And this also goes to when you have an infrastructure provider, they're generally on the cloud, right? And they may have multiple deployments across, let's say, US East, US West, EU, and Singapore, as an example. And like I mentioned before, Pocket is in 30 countries across dozens of clouds. And in fact, if I had to guess, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the network is not on the cloud. So this is kind of bare metal setups, even people running Pocket nodes in their homes. So when I talk about reliability, when we see, the multiple AWS outages that we've seen over the last couple of years, Pocket is immune to stuff like that today, which is really, really important and impactful. And what's really interesting is the way the incentives work. So I was looking at some of the data on one of the block explorers built by the community. And this is kind of what's really interesting about Pocket and it being a kind of Web3 native protocol as opposed to a kind of traditional centralized SaaS business. About a week ago, we had about 4,000 kind of Pocket node runners supporting Fantom. And as soon as our Fantom traffic RPC started to pick up, over the course of about 3 to 4 days, we went up to over 14,000 Pocket nodes. I'm not sure about the distribution of that, but I'd be willing to bet that it's pretty well evenly distributed across the world, really depending on where a lot of that traffic is. So what's really interesting about that is by driving traffic to Pocket, it's actually further decentralizing Fantom at the node level and providing more reliability as well, which is really exciting for us to see.
I would imagine one of the questions that maybe people coming from Web 2.0 or software as a service type companies might be wondering is, okay, well, what does an incentive mean in Web3? What does it mean to incentivize Pocket node providers? And so if you take the example of how does a traditional centralized RPC infrastructure provider work, what you're really looking at is you have a company that has its servers, say, in AWS, that's in the cloud. And then you can get a certain amount of calls as a DApp for free. And then beyond that, you can buy an enterprise package where you get a certain amount of calls that you can make per year. And it's very clear what the incentives are there, right? Like the company is charging an annual recurring revenue fee and you're getting the service in return. Now, when we look at the decentralized infrastructure, what we're talking about, you said, people running their own nodes, maybe even at home, that 10 to 20%. What if we could just kind of break down the tokenomics and the incentives beyond why somebody would want to do this and how that helps secure the network as opposed to the traditional system of how a centralized company works? I think that would be really useful for the audience as well.
Yeah, one important note there about differences between Pocket 2 are you highlighted this perfectly, right? I'm a centralized company that is someone that's running on the cloud, right? So there's kind of two kind of rent extraction bottlenecks there. One, to operate at the scale of one of these centralized companies, they have to run on the cloud, right? It's incredibly unlikely that they raise tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to, for example, purchase data centers around the world, right? To kind of own their own infrastructure. It makes a lot more sense economically for a centralized company to run on AWS, GCP, and so on, right? So I don't know if you're familiar with a post, I believe it was by Ben Thompson, but he talks about the Amazon tax, and it's effectively a tax on the internet where we have Amazon that really provides a lot of the infrastructure for the companies that we use today. And they're effectively just taking a certain percentage from all of that usage, right? So that's one thing that's really important to note. On the other side, you also have a company that has bills to pay, right? So they also have to charge additional on top of already running on Amazon. So what Pocket does is completely remove both those aspects from the node side of things, right? So if I'm an individual node on Pocket Network, I don't need to run infrastructure at scale across multiple clouds because I know that I have backups across the entire world with other individual node runners who are participating in the network. Additionally, since I don't have to run that at scale, and we're seeing this just play out in terms of economics of the network, I am incentivized to reduce my costs. And by doing that, I can, buy the hardware or run on a bare metal, which is, or in some local data center, which is significantly cheaper than running on the traditional cloud. So you kind of have this trustless protocol that takes no rent, that does the coordination of what a centralized entity would do, and basically takes out those two bottlenecks in one fell swoop. So over the long run, Pocket becomes significantly cheaper to operate as a network than a centralized entity. And in terms of your original question about how these incentives work, like you said, in a traditional SaaS business, the centralized company's incentives are, hey, I'm going to charge fees for, per RPC request or per usage. In Pocket, we have a different model. We don't use actually direct fees in the network. We have a staking, minting, and burn model. So a developer, instead of paying a monthly fee to the network, to a centralized provider, they would actually purchase POCT and stake it within the network. The difference here is that instead of paying a monthly fee, we ask for about 10 months of what that monthly fee is in upfront POCT. So if I'm paying $100 a month for let's say 100,000 requests a day in POCT, I would pay about $1,000 once and stake it within the network. What's really interesting about that from the developer side of things is so it turns something that was a capital expenditure into an asset. And that asset today doesn't get burned. So what that means for the developer is that the longer I use Pocket, the closer my cost basis reaches zero. And that's important for the economics of the network because they're pulling out more POC out of circulation, which allows the token itself to kind of capture some of this value. And on the other side of things, you have nodes that are providing this RPC service. So instead of paying a direct fee like you would traditionally, like a developer traditionally would, nodes actually mint a static amount of POC per RPC request that gets validated by the network. And this has an interesting effect of allowing us to bootstrap the network in a novel way by separating how developers pay versus how nodes get rewarded. So we've actually gone through quite a few changes in terms of economics. For example, we've bootstrapped a pretty reliable network at this point. So, for example, we went through kind of like a proposal a few months ago to lower those rewards, as an example, right? As we've grown massively in traffic. But you can kind of think of it. I like to kind of compare it to kind of video game design. So if you've ever looked at something like that, you have sources and sinks, right? The source of Pocket Network is nodes providing RPC service and minting POC, and the sinks are nodes staking POC and applications staking POC. And then you have permanent sinks like various types of burning mechanisms and this sort of thing over the long run. So over time, you'll kind of see kind of a balanced economy in terms of how value gets transferred compared to kind of a traditional SaaS model.
Wow, that's a lot of thought that's gone into that, and I'm not quite sure I've heard of any tokenomics models that are similar to that. So I'd love to pick your brain later and learn a little bit more about what the inspirations were behind that. But Michael Kong, going back to you, now that we're on the topic of infrastructure coming to Fantom, hopefully this conversation has shed some light on the kinds of issues that Pocket mitigates. But I'm curious to hear from your perspective, what are some other areas of opportunity for infrastructure providers coming to Fantom that people should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so like we've been, talking to like a variety of different providers. I mean, like some of the like infrastructure that I think we're lacking at the moment is, for example, like to do with like analysis of say like NFTs. So, I think we've got like a great like RPC API suite, or RPC like number of providers, including like Pocket across the network. I think we have like a lot of like good calls when it comes to RPC calls. I mean, when it comes to like DeFi applications, and we actually are expanding on that with Amazon Web Services. But on the NFT side, I think we're kind of like lacking there. We just don't have like as many as much documentation, as many like API calls that are easily available for people to like read data off chain. I mean, we have some of them, but honestly, like not that many. So I think that's where we're lacking at the moment if we're talking about APIs for the network.
Yeah, and since we've given I think a pretty in-depth overview so far of Pocket to maybe our native Fantom people who weren't aware of it, for those POC to Pi that are on the call, what are you, Michael Kong, most excited about in terms of development happening on Fantom? Maybe specific areas or verticals that people might want to look out for, and reasons they might want to come to Fantom to try to experiment and try these different things out.
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned before, like right now, like the Fantom technology stack is our own like layer one consensus engine that we built from scratch. That's connected to the Ethereum virtual machine and the Geth client. So the infrastructure that Ethereum has when it comes to like processing smart contracts, and on top of that is your standard like Web3 APIs and RPC calls that you can make like on Ethereum, you can make on Fantom. But in terms of like technology progress, I mean, the main aim of the foundation is to keep developing the underlying technology. So that's essentially the core and the middleware development, as we call it, or the smart contract execution engine. So we have like two teams that are working on both. When it comes to the core development, what's kind of interesting, I think, for Fantom's technology is that we kind of discovered that the consensus engine, or the rules that the validator nodes follow in order to confirm transactions, is actually very, very fast. um, is actually like so fast that it's other bottlenecks in the transaction processing, in the way that transaction processing works, that kind of like slows down the network quite significantly. So, I've been talking to like our CTO Quan Nguyen about like how much we could increase network throughput, and we could increase network throughput several times more than it already currently is. But the limitation has to do with like kind of three main issues we discovered. One of them is synchronization times between nodes. So if the consensus is too fast and the nodes can't sync with one another, then nodes, over time will start falling behind. They'll start falling behind in blocks, and then eventually they won't be able to catch up, and the network will prune them because they're too far behind. And that of course is a bad thing because then it kind of brings the network down. The second issue has to do with the level of input and outputs, or the amount of data going in and out of nodes when you process in transactions, because that orders all that data needs to be processed and stored in a database. And that database that's commonly used right now is called Level DB. But we kind of found out in our own like research and development that switching the database and making some modifications to a new database called Pebble DB can significantly reduce the amount of data that needs to be processed for transactions. I think right now, by a factor of around 90%, which is huge. And we actually have deployed this new database on our API nodes on the mainnet. And so we got something actually like running in prod, and we're testing in prod. And while testing in prod, we kind of figured out that there actually are a couple of technical issues, most notably to do with like the generation of redundant data on the network. It just like sometimes the database for some reason duplicates a bit of data, and so we're working on fixing that problem. And once this problem is fixed and we do a bit more testing, then we'll be comfortable to roll out the solution to other like RPC nodes, API nodes that are out there, and then eventually to validators themselves. So once that's fully implemented, we can allow the consensus to run much faster than it currently does, because we've resolved those kind of bottlenecks. And with the first bottleneck around synchronization, we have this upgrade that we're going to trigger at any moment now. We're just doing some final checks. It's called Snap Sync, and it allows you to basically sync between nodes much faster than using like just a standard consensus that we have at the moment. Because the consensus engine that we have at the moment, you need that to confirm transactions, but you don't necessarily need it to validate transactions. And what I mean by validating transactions is, when transactions are already confirmed by the network and you just want to sync your node to the latest block, you can actually use a variation of our algorithm that we call. So the consensus engine is called Lachesis, and so we developed a new similar consensus called the Lachesis Light Repeater, and it basically allows you to do synchronization between nodes a lot faster. So once that upgrade gets triggered, people will start to see the immediate benefits, and the network will already be scanning up. The third issue we're working on has to do with the middleware stack, and the middleware stack is essentially the software layer that actually executes smart contracts. So when you like write a smart contract, you write in like English, right? Like Solidity, humans can understand it, and then you run it through what's known as compiler. And the compiler is basically like a translator. It translates your code that you've written into something that the computer can understand, and so it translates it into what is known as like a sequence of instructions that actually get like executed by the machine itself. And the machine uses a software layer called a virtual machine that actually execute these instructions in a particular pattern each time you do like a function call or any interaction with a smart contract. So that software layer, the EVM software layer is very good. Obviously it works. It's handled billions of dollars and billions of transactions over time. It's existed since 2015, and when it came out, it was definitely like very innovative, and that was obviously the clear differentiator between Ethereum and Bitcoin. The problem with this middleware layer, there's a number of problems. Like one of them is that it's actually like very slow, and it has to do with the way that it processes data. So in our testing, when we've removed the EVM and we've just been doing account to account transfers, we get throughput levels that are like 15 to 20 times higher than when we include the EVM, and that's because the way that they read and write data is like very slow on chain because of the particular data structures they use. And so if we can replace those data structures with a much more efficient data structure while still maintaining the same security properties, then we've already significantly improved the execution of smart contracts, and in particular more complicated smart contract transactions. And it costs a lot, use a lot of gas. If you can execute those a lot more efficiently, then the cost of those more expensive transactions actually can go down significantly. So there's a number of like areas of improvements that we're working on the middleware. Eventually, over like the next few years, we want to replace the entire middleware stack with our new one, with a new virtual machine that has security checks at the virtual machine level. And of course, like a new compiler to that new virtual machine. So these are kind of like the three like immediate like bottlenecks that we're tackling on chain, so we can so the Fantom network can obviously run a lot faster than it currently does.
So for those of you listening, if you heard that last part, the transition from the Ethereum virtual machine to the Fantom virtual machine in combination with Pocket Network on Fantom is going to mean not only that everything is executed fast as hell, but that nobody's going to be able to stop you from doing whatever it is that you need to do. And on that topic, Michael O'Rourke, I'd like to hear a little bit. I know that you're passionate about this subject, and obviously that's why you're doing what you're doing today. But I'd like to hear, sort of from a more philosophical angle, why is censorship resistance and decentralization an important topic to you, and why is that what your company has chosen to focus on doing?
Yeah, that goes back to a few things. To be honest, I mentioned I think there's a couple experiences in my life that have kind of contributed to this, to where I am today in terms of my thinking. I mentioned I was from the Dominican Republic earlier, but I grew up in the U.S. So I've used Western Union enough times to really feel that pain. And when I first discovered Bitcoin in 2013, and just playing around with it, sending kind of value to my cousins, my mind was just absolutely blown. I just was like, how is this possible? And just immediately kind of started looking into it. Also, in 2011 and 2012, I worked at some credit unions before I discovered Bitcoin, and I was selling loans actually, and I saw thousands of credit reports. And I'd say out of anything, that probably radicalized me the most. You kind of see how difficult the financial system can be for some people, just based on kind of the U.S. credit system as an example. And I think more directly to Pocket, my time as an iOS developer, building iPhone apps, my first experience getting rugged was through the Twitter API actually, or the Facebook API or the Google API, where they changed something without telling you, and all of a sudden you have to scramble to fix something in your app, or completely in the worst case changes your business, right? There's lots of examples of that happening over time. So kind of I'd say those things combined kind of really led me to Pocket, along with my co-founders, in terms of kind of understanding the importance of this. I'm convinced that we're really kind of building. We have the opportunity to kind of rebuild the infrastructure of society, and I mean that digitally and physically, in a world that is native to the internet, right? We are kind of living in a world with physical infrastructure that is at this point hundreds of years old, and we have the internet that has just absolutely changed everything about how we live, and frankly is changing how we work, how we live, where we live, these sorts of things. And in this kind of world that things are changing so quickly, we have this incredible kind of human coordination mechanism with blockchains that are really giving us the opportunity to kind of believe in something, especially in the world where it's becoming increasingly more secular. We have little to zero trust in our own institutions, and all of a sudden we have these incredible things that allow us to agree on things regardless of who you are, where you live, or anything like that, right? And that is just, for me, just incredibly exciting. And I kind of just view Pocket Network and really protocols like Fantom and all these other blockchains as really an opportunity to let's say revise or rebuild really the society that we live in, and particularly when it comes to things like public goods with core infrastructure. I mean, I think we're seeing this with Twitter recently, with kind of the purchase from Elon Musk, but so many things that we depend on are owned by centralized companies today. And I think it's really important for these things to exist as public goods. And for example, in Pocket's governance, any user can become a voter in our DAO, as an example. And I'd much rather live in a world where one of the core infrastructure that we all depend on is an opt-in democracy rather than kind of a top-down, Amazon Web Services type deal, right? So that's for me really more than anything what motivates me and gets me excited about this space.
There's a question I want to ask you there about how people can get involved, but as you're speaking on the subject, I came back to thinking about a common sort of criticism I hear sometimes from the specific Bitcoin maximalist community about well, sure, nodes can be decentralized, you can run one in your home, but if it requires basically DevOps experience to get it set up, then how many people are actually going to be able to do that? And if I think to what Bitcoin's got going on, for example, at the moment, you can, with relatively little technical experience, set up something like an Umbrel node at home with a Raspberry Pi. But I'd be curious, what do you see as the future moving forward for this to really become something that becomes democratized, where anybody who knows how to turn on a computer can run a node at home and start contributing? And how is that going to be different from where we are today, where it is still relegated to a smaller subset of people with technical expertise?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we see all these infrastructure providers, and they're all effectively reinventing the wheel with their own individual setups that are closed source. And with Pocket, what's really fascinating is that we, along with the community, are incentivized to open source all of our tooling. And that's resulted in a bunch of things. I think a really important one to highlight is something like Node Pilot. While early, that's actually allowing anyone who's non-technical to be able to spin up nodes with a pretty simple GUI or graphical user interface, right? And what's really interesting about this is that as Pocket starts to scale and we start to add more blockchains, the tooling is kind of following in that direction. So we, for example, released a product called the Node Nanny to make this really easy for people to make it really easy for people to monitor their Pocket nodes and blockchain nodes at scale. And effectively, what's happening is there's an incentive to improve the tooling, and as it becomes easier for people to run individual Pocket nodes, that will continue to kind of scale as maybe you have 5 Pocket nodes or 10 Pocket nodes, right? So we kind of flipped those, what was previously kind of private information. We kind of just invert that, right? Where everyone is actually incentivized to share information, ourselves included, and their setups, right? Because it improves the quality of service of the protocol, which makes it much more likely for people to want to use the service itself, right? Which is really exciting for us. So to answer your question, I see a future where people are running Pocket nodes or even other middleware protocols, all kind of in a single, let's call it, router type device in their homes. There's obviously limits to this, but look at Arweave, Helium, Pocket. There's just so many different types of nodes, let's call them, and kind of, I think in the future we'll start to see people kind of directly plugging into Web3 through methods like this.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's I think what everybody's optimistic to see continue to develop. And so before we go back to Michael Kong, because a few questions to ask him, I wanted to say for those who perhaps aren't ready to jump into the fray and start running a node right now, but based on this conversation, they're terrified of a 1984 type future that's ruled by a handful of companies deciding how information flows, what truth is, and what data belongs to who. How can these people get involved in other ways besides for running a node with Pocket Network?
Yeah, it's actually quite easy to mint an RPC endpoint for Fantom today, and you can just plug that into whatever wallet or Web3 browser that you're using today, right? Through kind of the custom RPC endpoint. I believe we have guides on that. So it's actually pretty simple. If you go to our documentation and kind of search Fantom in that documentation, you should be able to find information on just even switching over your RPC just drives this entire effort that we're working on, right? Which is quite exciting. And on the node side, of course, even if you're not technical enough to run a node, there are different types of node providers that can do that for you as well. But for us to be able to drive that traffic to Pocket and further kind of increase the resilience of the network is just, super priority for us and really one of the most important things for us today.
I love it. So Michael Kong, now that we've asked Michael O'Rourke about sort of the philosophical vision of why he's doing what he's doing, would love to hear from you kind of before we start wrapping this conversation up, why what you're doing is important to you personally, and also how something like Pocket Network on Fantom is important to the future of the kind of decentralized Web3 we want to accomplish.
Yeah, great question. I mean, like, providers like Pocket Network really just add to like, the security through decentralization of the network, right? Because they're another like solid like obviously provider on the network that people can like choose to use, or they can use someone else. It's really up to them. And so it's not just like one RPC provider on the network, right? It's not like everyone has to rely on the foundation nodes, or everyone has to rely on, you know, any single company's nodes. They have choice, and they can distribute their requests across multiple nodes. If they wanted to achieve like decentralization for their own applications when it comes to RPC requests, so it doesn't just have to go through like a single provider, which is obviously like potentially a single point of failure. Like why am I working at Fantom? Well, I kind of was a bit of the accidental CEO because how we played out. But like kind of my passion is just to like develop the technology as far as possible and get it to use as much as possible. I mean, for me, it's like the journey never ends. There'll always be more problems to solve. There'll always be more technical problems to solve. There'll always be more growth that can be had. And so for me, we want to build the highest quality technology that's out there to really solve the user experience problem. Because in the end, all the technology development is about solving or improving the user experience. And the users in the end, when it comes to transactions, really care about three things. They care about how fast, how long does it take for my transaction to be confirmed, how cheap, like how expensive it is, and also is it secure. And so everything we do is just optimizing for that. And we want to be part of this huge growth in the crypto ecosystem, because I believe that the crypto ecosystem, or the blockchain ecosystem as a whole, is going to be as big as the internet is. I kind of see parallels if you watch old videos of the internet. Back in the early 1990s, people like on talk shows talking about what is this thing called the internet. It's kind of weird. You have browsers, you have keyboards. You can like apparently talk to one another over this internet. And so I kind of feel like blockchain technology is in that same time frame of the early 1990s, where people were like, what is this blockchain technology? What is MetaMask? What are all of these services? And I think over time, people will get like more and more educated and more experience on how these applications use, and they'll just like tell their friends, and their friends will get on board and learn themselves, and it will just kind of grow organically to as big as the internet has been. So I think blockchain technology as a whole can have like a billion plus users at a minimum. But we have to also scale out the technology as well to handle that extra capacity, and that's exactly the sort of like technical problems that we're focused on. So when there's more adoption over time, that we'll be able to capture as much of that adoption as possible, and to allow developers to build awesome applications on Fantom to take advantage of that level of adoption.
Fantastic. So that's the future of Fantom, and what we're all looking forward to it. Michael O'Rourke, for you guys, I know you said you're on 40 something chains already. What does the future for you all look like outside of just Fantom? And what are your sort of next immediate steps in continuing to expand the POC to Pi empire?
Yeah, there's a couple things there actually. One is related to a previous question you asked with what others can do as well. So we have a stated goal of reaching 100 supported chains before the end of the year, and we just recently announced an initiative from our end called Triforce. And Triforce is really interesting for us because I believe we're going to live in a world. I mean, take look at with thousands or tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of blockchains. I mean, look at Celestia, look at Cosmos, look at Parachains, Near, F2 shards. I mean, it's pretty clear that we're starting to live in an increasingly multi-chain world. So Triforce for us is an effort to kind of scale through the community. And what's really interesting about Triforce is that you kind of have an individual Triforce shard where, which by the way, this was actually, if anyone played Zelda, that's what it was named after, where you have kind of a DevOps, a business development person and a kind of like a marketing and slash community person. So if you have skill sets related to that, for example, with Fantom, you could potentially participate in these sorts of shards across the different chains that Pocket supports. So that's something really exciting for us. We're really working on scaling. You can think of us as almost like a Uniswap for node infrastructure of sorts in that respect. So that's one thing that we're really excited about. Another thing that Michael, you had mentioned previously about kind of NFT and indexing data. We're in the very, very earliest, extremely early stages of kind of looking into how Pocket can support just generalized indexing across different chains. So for context, blockchain nodes are effectively databases, and Pocket actually supports any openly accessible database that our node runners can sync themselves. So in a world where I've got an SQL database that other nodes can sync and run themselves, Pocket could actually feasibly support different types of indexed solutions, including NFTs. So we're kind of starting to look into that, although it's extremely early. And lastly, we also earlier this year announced Pocket 1.0. This is something that we're extremely, extremely excited about. It's something the team's been working on for almost a year at this point, and we released the specs for this in January earlier this year. So I definitely would keep an eye out to more information on that. But Pocket 1.0 is really what's going to allow the protocol to scale to hundreds of billions and trillions of relays, and eventually more than that.
And for those who want to stay up to date with everything that's going on over at Pocket and with you personally, what is the best way to keep up to date? Is there an email newsletter, or is it just subscribing to your Twitter, or how can people stay involved?
Yeah, we have all sorts of types of kind of outlets. I'd say our Twitter and our own newsletter is how people keep most up to date. As well as in the future, we actually announced our own conference a couple of months ago. That's actually happening in 2 weeks, exactly 2 weeks from today, actually. So we're extremely excited about that. And that'll be in InfraCon, the Pocket Community Conference in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. So if you weren't able to make it to this one, there will definitely be annual versions of those to keep up with things, meet up with the team, and really kind of hear from the horse's mouth, as they say, as what's going on within the protocol.
Nice. Going back to your roots for the conference. I love it.
Yeah.
And then Michael Kong, for those who want to stay up to date on Fantom and everything you're doing as CEO, what's the best way to keep in touch?
The best way is to go to Fantom.foundation. So on Fantom.foundation, you'll see a lot of details on Fantom's technology, links to technical papers, our GitHub where all of the code is open source for the underlying network, as well as like links to our socials, and information more on like the team and some like applications that are developed on Fantom, like the mostly like the biggest ones listed there. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Fantom FTN. So at Fantom FTN. So from the account that I'm doing this AMA from, that's where we usually push out the latest updates, as well as in Discord and other places. But really, yeah, like the number one go-to resource is the website Fantom.foundation.
Perfect. So thank you to both Michaels for taking the time out of their busy day to have this chat and inform the whole community as to what's going on. Thanks to everyone who listened in, both from the Pocket Network side and the Fantom side, and hopefully there were also some people in the crowd who aren't familiar with Web3, and this was maybe your first learning experience, and you're coming to understand why this is such an important thing for the future we all want. So again, thanks everybody. And unless there are any last words from either the two Michaels, I think we can wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity of having us, and really enjoyed speaking to you, Michael, and thanks for hosting one.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks Michael as well for speaking alongside of me, and thanks Juan for hosting this, and thanks guys for listening as well. Really appreciate it.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
See you everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you.